woman who worked on the front lines throughout the pandemic is now out of a job. This St. Louis doctor, Dr. Molly James, says her days in the ICU are done after she refused to get the COVID-19 vaccine. Now James is taking what she's learned about early intervention treatments and opening her own business. Our Caroline Hecker investigating her COVID claims and why the doctor says it's hospitals getting in the way of patient care.
Dr. Molly James says she's been an ICU doctor for 11 years, helping thousands of patients along the way. She's a doctor of osteopathic medicine, taking a holistic approach to care. So when COVID-19 began ravaging parts of the U.S., James took a volunteer position at a New York hospital in April of 2020.
My purpose for going was to help them out, but also to see what they were doing real time and what was most effective for patients so I could bring that back to the community.
James says despite recovering from COVID herself the month before, she was nervous about the unknown.
I was scared, so I have a lot of empathy for the people who live in fear because we didn't know, and about that time nurses were dying, doctors were dying, and so I didn't know what we were getting into.
Freezer trucks became makeshift morgues outside her hospital, a constant reminder, she says, of the need to wear personal protective equipment. She traveled between work in New York and St. Louis throughout 2020. But last winter, after hearing Dr. Pierre Corey, another ICU doctor, testify in front of a Senate committee about the effectiveness of the drug ivermectin, James says it piqued her interest.
And at the time I wasn't familiar with that medication, so I started looking into it and the dosing protocols and the side effects and the downsides to it. And we started slowly using that in a few patients. Then the pandemic numbers went down. I didn't really see a big difference at that time.
But when a surge of COVID-19 cases began popping up in southwest Missouri earlier this year, she circled back to ivermectin.
When I was able to properly dose and use ivermectin in an ICU patient, I saw the fastest turnaround of any patient out of probably a couple thousand that I've treated.
According to the FDA, ivermectin tablets are approved for use in humans at very specific doses to treat some parasitic worms. But James says it's an effective way to treat COVID-19 too.
And I had 2 patient successes at the hospital that was offering it, and they pulled it off the shelf a week later.
Why?
I don't know. I was told it wasn't approved by the COVID committee, so doctors who were not involved in the patient's care, my patient's care, were making decisions about what I could use.
We took James's claims to Dr. Clay Dunnigan, the head of the St. Louis Metropolitan Pandemic Task Force.
It's conceivable that ivermectin has some impact early in disease, but it's really not something we should be using right now. We have other drugs that are more effective.
That's because, he says, early data shows it does not make much of a difference, and he believes remdesivir, an antiviral drug, along with other steroids, benefit patients more.
When you have administrators telling physicians what medications they can prescribe or how to counsel patients regarding interventions or telling them not to do something that they believe is in the patient's best interest, I think doctors have an obligation to leave those situations.
But Dunnigan points out these are committees, sometimes comprised of doctors and pharmacists who make decisions on treatment protocol.
Those groups are invaluable in providing an objective look at what works and what doesn't work.
As for the vaccine itself, James says she does not encourage her patients to get vaccinated, claiming most will not benefit from it. In part, she points to this early-on Pfizer study that found 95% efficacy in the vaccine 2 months after the second shot. James says that's too short of a time frame to judge effectiveness, but the task force says more data has since been collected showing the protection of the vaccine long-term. Because she's already recovered from COVID-19, Dr. James says she has natural immunity, so she sees no medical reason to get the vaccine. And despite not encouraging her own patients to get the shot, she says it is a conversation everyone should have with their doctor. James is currently seeing patients from around the country through her virtual clinic and prescribing them an assortment of drugs, including ivermectin. She admits her stance is in the minority of healthcare workers, both on using ivermectin and getting vaccinated.
The benefits of vaccination are dramatic in terms of preventing the bad things that can happen from COVID. The treatments that we use after people have been infected, they do provide some benefit, but they're certainly not silver bullets.
Dr. Dunnigan says, above all else, getting vaccinated is critical, and patients should not be treated with ivermectin until more data is released.
Getting through medical school doesn't mean that you're always able to interpret and use science in the proper way. So we've got people who are mounting a counter narrative, but I think the vast majority of the medical establishment is pretty aligned on these things.
Dr. James did not want to disclose which 2 local hospitals she's worked at previously, but she says as she continues to prescribe ivermectin and an assortment of other medications to her patients, pharmacies and insurance companies are making that increasingly difficult. Many pharmacists, she says, are refusing to fill scripts for ivermectin, and insurance companies won't cover it, leaving patients paying out of pocket. Dr. Dunnigan says he's confident in the treatment regimen hospitals are currently using and says decreasing hospitalization numbers are proof of its effectiveness. Caroline Hecker, News 4.